shall be the whole of the law.
Love's law, love and do will.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on a Tuesday night to hear me talk about this subject. Dominic is the one who requested this subject, so this is his fault, and it's dedicated to him. This is a topic that I think I've been studying for over 10 years, and so I just want to be clear about what my background is, who am I and who am I not when it comes to Sufism. So I have no academic degree in Islamic studies or in Sufic studies, so I'm not claiming to be an expert at all in this subject. My experience is largely being an independent scholar and also at one point being a participant in a Whirling Dervish order that when I was in it was in Berkeley. And so my background is I used to be a Muslim in my complicated spiritual journey. I converted to Islam in 2007 when I was 17 going on 18, and I was a Muslim for about 6 years, and during that chunk of time of my life, what got me into Islam was reading the poetry of Rumi. And so how many of you are familiar with Rumi? Okay. And he is considered by most folks who are in literary circles to be the most popular poet in the world today. And that has been because his poetry has been translated into many languages, over 20 languages, and especially in the English-speaking areas, Western Europe or even in the United States, there's just been this huge explosion of scholarship since the 70s to just keep translating him over and over again. And then you have folks like Coleman Barks who take already translated poems and then translate them into a more contemporary English. So this has been a constant publication craze. Pretty much anything with Rumi's name on it sells. And so his ideas get spread pretty consistently. But of course, it's always complicated. Like, who is this guy and why? And what is Sufism? How many of you are familiar with Sufism as a topic? Okay, so my talk tonight's going to be a little selfish because I'm going to talk about it from how I experienced the Mevlevi order, and I'm going to really focus on that. But I'm also going to tell you a little bit of background about what is Sufism and why is it important to have an understanding of this particular form of mysticism. Sufism is the mystical branch of the religion of Islam. Some people, you may hear or read on the internet that Sufism is a completely separate entity, like the Sunni and Shia split in Islam, but that is incorrect. Sufism is an inner esoteric dimension that all Muslims, regardless of their sectarian affiliations, can partake in. That is true from the very beginning, and the earliest reference to Sufism or Sufis is a couple hundred years after the Prophet Muhammad's death. So he dies, near the end of the 8th century, and a couple hundred years after his death, you have accounts of people described as wearing suf, or certain cloaks that they didn't really seem to fix very often, and if they did, if there was a hole in it, they would just patch through patches to make some sort of minor repairs. And these were folks who would never leave the mosque, or rarely, and they seemed to want to just stay in the confines of the mosque and pray continuously, and they seemed to live a very, what might be described as a monastic life. Until we get to about the 11th century, that's when you have the rise of certain scholars who start identifying as Sufi teachers or Sufi sheikhs. And to identify as a Sufi, again, is a right of any Muslim, but who is a teacher, who's an authentic teacher? And this is a debate that has raged within Islam's history all the way up to the present. Who has the authority to say that they're a Sufi teacher and who's representing Sufism? There's no answer to that question. And I don't think there ever will be, because there is no there never has been a central power within Islam's history, and there's never been a central power within Islam. In Sufism. So you can have a number of people who claim to be representatives of it, and they usually fall into two categories. There is a way in which Muslim scholars become what were called, they study fiqh, which is the legal codes of Islam, which I think many of you would be familiar with the word Sharia.
Yeah.
And so Sharia is the law that covers all aspects of a Muslim's life. And it is codified, at least now in the Sunni world, which is the vast majority of Muslims around the world would identify as a Sunni Muslim, 4 schools of thought. And these jurists study Islam's sacred text to derive rulings on how to live one's life. It's very similar to Jewish dietary laws and prescriptions in that context, very similar. So you have scholars who would attain this mastery of the science of Sharia, and then they would say, oh, but there's this inner dimension that we want to study, which brings people to gnosis or to this union with the divine, and we should try and study the science of that too. So you had these scholars who were really well known for issuing statements about, mundane opinions, like if I want to sell something that's worth this amount, what's a good deal for it, et cetera, or is this allowed or is it not allowed? And then they would also offer opinions on mystical trainings. A second category of people, though, didn't have this formal training in the sense of becoming legal scholars. They would join a Sufi lodge, and this was more prevalent starting around the 11th century, moving up until I guess the fall of the Ottoman Empire, technically, at the end of World War I, where you would have people who could be initiated into these Sufi orders, and then there they would learn how Sufis approach the Quran and other sacred Islamic texts, but they would get it primarily from this mystical perspective. And then they could become teachers, and they could go and they could teach other people and start their own lodges if they advance to a certain level. They don't really use the word degrees in their initiatic system, but there is an initiation process, which I'll talk about momentarily. So I say all that because if what I've been talking about so far sounds really confusing, it's because it actually is, in terms of who has the authority to talk about what we're talking about tonight. And if you go on Google and start Googling Sufism, Islam, et cetera, welcome to the rabbit hole that is Google, because you'll just find all these different contradictory statements about is it okay, is it not okay. Sufism within Islam has had a very complex history. There are moments where Sufis were spreading the religion to areas that were uncharted territory throughout the Middle East. So they were representing the faith, and a lot of people converted because of Sufi masters. But again, this question of authority and the tension between orthodoxy and mysticism, which happens in, I think, all religions, is something that has manifested itself in Islam's history, which is why you hear stories of Sufi mosques being destroyed and persecution of certain Sufi groups. Today, in modern-day Turkey, which is the origin of the Mevlevi order, it is illegal to actually practice as an official Mevlevi lodge in Turkey. The only way you're allowed to ever see the Sema dance, the whirling dance, is under strict legal codes set up by the government that allows public performances at very specific fixed times throughout the year. So it's heavily controlled by the government, which is why Sufism, I think, especially the Mevlevi order, has become more popular in Western Europe and the United States, because they don't have those types of restrictions. So during the 80s, the 90s, leading up to now, Mevlevi teachers were coming over to the United States and starting orders over here, or lodges here, and initiating people here. So by the time I came upon the Mevlevi order that existed in Berkeley, it was a combination of people who had been lifelong Muslims and then non-Muslims who had converted to Mevlevi Sufism but didn't really identify as a practicing Muslim. So there was this hybridity that occurred within the group, and I think that's just as a result of where Sufism has landed, especially here in the Bay Area, where everything, we have everything here in the Bay Area, right? It's all represented in terms of spiritual groups. So the Mevlevis, for those of you, how many of you have seen like a video of the Whirling Dervishes? Have you all sort of seen that? Okay, so I want to talk about that dance, and I want to talk about the clothing, because everything that you see in those videos is symbolic. The clothing is a representation of, well, here, maybe I should back up because this won't make any sense unless I talk about Rumi himself. So let me pause for a second. So Rumi, someone asked me earlier, what is the dates of Rumi's life? And like with many historical people, it's a question mark when he was born, when he died. Roughly 1205 to 1273 is his life. And who was he? He was the son of a scholar who was well known in Balkh, which is in Afghanistan. So that's where he was born, was in Afghanistan. And his father, Baha'uddin, was a well-known sheikh of legal thought and also of Sufism. And he was well respected in this region, which had a lot of diversity, and a lot of people started moving into the area because around the time of Rumi's childhood is when the Mongols were invading and pushing west. And so Kublai Khan brought his forces through Afghanistan, and it caused a massive migration of folks trying to get away from the onslaught of the Mongolian invasions. And if you're not aware of that part of human history, it was catastrophic. The Mongols, unlike previous invaders to the region, didn't really care about the nice libraries that had been built or the beautiful cities that had arisen in Baghdad and also heading in Damascus. So in other words, Mongols just laid waste to pretty much everything. There are reports of the destruction of the library in Baghdad, where the once blue rivers were black with the ink of all of the books that were poured into the rivers, and the mounds of human skulls that were piled up after the destruction of the city. Interesting enough, when the Mongols settled down, they converted to Sufi Islam. So it's kind of a little bit of irony there. But what that means is the Baha'uddin saw that the Mongols were invading, said, I have to get my family out of here. So he packs up young Rumi and Rumi's mother, and they start moving. And as they're moving, he continues trying to teach along the way, but they're always one step ahead of the Mongolian horde until they get to what is now Turkey. And they settle in Konya, Turkey. And at that time, on one hand, you had the diminishing Byzantine Christian Empire on the left and the Mongolians coming in the east. And all of these different people were all in Turkey at this time, right around the 13th century. So it was an eclectic area to live in. You had Persian Zoroastrians, you had Byzantine Christians, Jews, some Hindus, Buddhists that were making their way as well. So it was a very lively place to be, very multicultural. And this is reflected in Rumi's own writing because he writes some of his poetry in Latin, Greek. I don't think there's any Hindi in there, but Persian definitely being the primary mode of Farsi being the primary language, and a little bit of Turkish as well. So he was conversational in a lot of these languages, and that reflected the culture. When they arrive, his dad starts a school and has some teachers, and Rumi is sent off to become a legal scholar at a pretty young age, and he impresses people with his ability to come up with really good legal opinions just on the fly. And we have, there is one volume of his legal writings where it's just a question-answer format, and it's fascinating because someone will ask like a very basic question like, oh, great teacher, when I enter the mosque, should I enter with my left foot first or my right foot first? And he would give the answer, but it wasn't just like, well, of course it's your right foot. But he would like go on and on and on about like, well, why is that a thing, right? And so he had this depth of explaining things both practically, symbolically, and esoterically, all within one answer. So he started to get this reputation already, probably because his father was speaking so highly of Sufis during the time. And I'd like to read a passage here. This is from his father's book, Baha'uddin's book. And the section here says, an eminent jurist asked me to explain what an enlightened being is. Someone so aware of depth and mystery that he or she doesn't consider paradise or hell, usury or the prohibition against wine, this life, or the possible resurrection. Such matters do not occur to a Gnostic master who simply knows himself or herself and says nothing of presence, whose soul is the wine of wisdom gone mad. A candle has been lit inside me for which the sun is a moth. All right, so there's this playfulness that's with some of these Sufi teachers, and I think that's why they get into trouble and got into trouble with some of the more orthodox dogmatic thinkers of their time. So Rumi has his father's book. So his father dies, and Rumi then essentially becomes this great sheikh of Konya, Turkey, and he's carrying around his father's book, and he's carrying, he has his students, and he's very popular, and he gets married a couple times. He had one wife who ended up dying. He remarries and has one son in particular who will be important to talk about in a moment. But Rumi, at this point in his life, is just this rock star of a scholar. And one day he's sitting next to his favorite fountain, a beautiful fountain, and this story has different versions because that's just how these things are, or reports. You got about 6 contradictory stories, so I'll just give you the basic. But Rumi thought at this point, well, I've read all these books, I'm a teacher, I know all these things. And he's sitting there reading his father's book, and this stranger walks up to him. A stranger wearing filthy robes. It seemed like this guy had been traveling for some time. And he walks up to Rumi and he asks Rumi a question which none of the accounts are consistent about what the question was. But it was something about like, oh, great teacher. This person addresses Rumi as a great teacher. Who's greater, this Sufi master or the Prophet Muhammad? Now that's a scary question to be asked, because how do you answer that question? And this stranger poses it like, because the Prophet Muhammad at one point said that he didn't have knowledge of certain things, and this Sufi teacher said he had knowledge of all, right? And so it was kind of like a koan, and I'm not really sure what Rumi's response was. He tries to offer a response, and then the stranger responds to him, and it just blows Rumi's mind. And not only is his mind blown, but then the stranger picks up Rumi's father's book, and he says, I have a feeling that you're obsessed with just reading, but you're not doing it. He takes the book and he throws it into the well, or into the fountain, right? And Rumi's, freaking out, trying to grab it, right? And he sees it submerging in the water, he sees the ink, and then the stranger places his hand in it, pulls it out, and the book is dry, according to the story. This again blows Rumi's mind, because I don't think he saw that type of trick very often. Now, the stranger is Shams of Tabriz. Okay, so Shams is a famous wandering dervish of his time who falls into that second category I mentioned earlier, where he wasn't a trained legal scholar. He was initiated and learned under a number of different Sufi masters. We don't really know how many masters he had, because he had I guess he would have been diagnosed with ADHD if he had been around now, but he had a lot of energy and he wouldn't sit down for very long, okay? So in his book, and by the way, this book was not very well known, and we didn't really have translations of it until, I think this one was one of the first complete English translations, only done in 2008. So there's this whole perspective of the Rumi-Shams relationship, which we only had Rumi's perspective, and now we have Shams' perspective. But Shams was a very controversial figure because he liked to poke fun at the establishment. He really felt like the scholars of his day were heading in this direction where they were becoming too obsessed with dogmatic legalism, and they weren't talking very much about the soul or about the inner journey that leads to gnosis. And so he knew who Rumi was and was trolling him a little bit there. But then because he got his mind blown by Shams, Rumi's like, well, you're obviously a teacher and I need to learn from you. Now that's shocking, because that would be like, if you had a professor that you really admired, and I can't even think of a professor who's really well known around here, but imagine this professor publicly saying, I don't know anything, I'm deferring to this guy now. That was shocking to Rumi's students. And there are stories where they became friends. So after, I guess, the book is dry, they take the book and they start hanging out, and they would have these sessions where they would just stare at each other without speaking for like several hours, right? And then Shams would just start telling Rumi all these stories and trying to awaken in him this sense of what his father had started, but really driving home this notion that Rumi, you need to put the books down and actually start living your spirituality. And with that challenge, Rumi attempted to do that as much as possible. So he submitted himself to Shams' teachings, but as I said, it was shocking for Rumi's students, who were wondering, well, who is this guy Shams, and why, So there was this jealousy, that occurred. And they could tell that Shams and Rumi, there was a special connection, and both of them describe it as being in love. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment, because there's a lot of debate about, like, well, how in love were they, right? And always with historical people, you're always gonna have this bias of like, well, no, they couldn't have been, together in that sense, but we'll come back to that in a moment. But for right now, they admitted, at least the students knew, that there was this intense relationship, and it fueled their jealousy. Now, interestingly enough, one of the students was Sultan Valad, and he was Rumi's son by his second marriage. Now, Sultan Valad could see, and probably the bias, it's his dad, right? So it's like, but he could see that his dad was being transformed by this relationship, and he said, trying to convince the other students, I really think we need to let my dad just be with this guy, because I think the results are gonna be great. But the other students were like, hell no, because your dad's not paying us the respect or the attention that we deserve. And jealousy always ruins so many great things, right? So according to the story, one of the stories, the students made it very well known to Shams that he wasn't to be around anymore. So Shams, being, like I said, ADHD scholar, was like, fine, if I'm not wanted here, fine. So he's packed up his stuff and leaves. So Rumi comes home from teaching and he goes, where's Shams, right? And he had heard that Shams had not gotten very far. He was like a town over. And the story goes that Shams sends his son, Sultan Valad, to go bring Shams back. And when Sultan Valad gets there, Shams is just hanging out with, and the report literally says, it's a 17-year-old French boy. And they're playing a game. They're playing a game, And so Shams is just he's not upset at all. He's like, well, I'm no longer needed here. I guess I'm just going to move on. And Sultan Valad goes, no, don't pay attention to those assholes. Come on, you have to come back to the lodge, come back to my father, please. So he convinces them to come back, and they continue their friendship for a little bit longer. It's hard to know exactly this time frame. And then the second time, the angry students thought, well, we can't make him feel uncomfortable because he'll just come back, so how else can we get rid of him? We'll kill him. So the story goes that one night, they lured Shams out to this courtyard, and they proceed to stab him multiple times, kind of like Julius Caesar style. And his last words was fascinating, because usually the statement of faith for Muslims is La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. His last dying words were, there is no God but me, which is really controversial. And people who have ecstatic moments of gnosis have made that mistake to publicly say to people who don't know what they're talking about, I am God, or I am, and people go, what? So that's his last words, though, as they're stabbing him, right? So then he's dead, and then when they, didn't even do him the honor of taking care of his body, they just threw him in some garbage heap somewhere, and so there's this whole thing. So Rumi discovers this, and of course his heart is broken. Now, this whole story might be like, why are you telling us all this? Well, this is so important because when you read Rumi's poetry, it's the cry of separation. It's this grief that is just permeating throughout his entire poetic corpus. And after Shams dies and he's grief-stricken, he goes through this intense spiritual rebirth as a result of his grief. So late at night, what he would do is, after doing his meditations, he had this in his house. He had this post that was in the center of his house. And what he would do is, and some of his students, a couple of them, who were his scribes, he would enter into these mystical chants, and he would grasp the column in the center, and he would start to move in a circular fashion. And as he was doing this, he would start to recite poetry. And his students were like, holy crap, this is awesome stuff. We gotta start writing this down. So his students would start writing down what he was reciting, and it was this poetry. And that style of poems, these ghazals, are in what's called the Divan al-Kabir, and it's a total of 23 volumes of poetry. Okay, I'm such a nerd about this. I own all 23 volumes, and I was tempted to bring them here, but I'm like, no, that's a little excessive. But it's a set of 23 volumes. The last one is the Forbidden Rumi, which Dominic mentioned having a copy of, which is controversial because that was the last volume to be published by this translator who had the good fortune of knowing before he died, Nevid Ergen. I'll just name drop him. He's no longer with us, but he was a translator, did this beautiful translation, and he tried to do this last volume But it was being funded through the Turkish government because all the original manuscripts are there. And he wanted to translate this last volume, which is all the really juicy heretical poems. And the government was like, nope, we stop at 22. So Nevid Ergin had to do some, I don't know how he did it, but he was managed to do an unofficial publication of it. That's the Forbidden Rumi. Anyway, so these 23 volumes are what comes out of him during his grief process. And by the way, all of the poems, at least the majority of them, and the last stanza is always repetitious because he'll invoke Shams. He will invoke him at the end. So there is this deep connection even past death that he's still invoking Shams over and over again, and viewing him as the symbol of the sun, right? The sun that's always present. The sun is always there, even when you don't think it is, right? And that's what Shams represents for Rumi after Shams's murder. So after he has essentially recited enough poems to fill 23 volumes, if that wasn't enough, he then is asked by his students, this is when he's getting pretty advanced in his years, and his students say, teacher, it's great, we have some of your legal stuff, we've got these wonderful poems, but you haven't sat down and written anything. And he goes, well, it's funny you should say that, because he takes off his conical hat, which we'll come back to in a moment. And according to the story, he had already written on a parchment these words, which is the beginning of what is called the Masnavi, or what has been nicknamed the commentary of the Quran, or literally the Quran in Persian. Listen to the story told by the reed of being separated. Since I was cut from the reed bed, I have made this crying sound. Anyone separated from someone he loves understands what I say. Anyone pulled from a source longs to go back. At any gathering, I am there, mingling in the laughing and the grieving, a friend to each. But few will hear the secrets hidden within the notes. No ears for that. Body flowing out of spirit, spirit flowing from body. No concealing the mixing, but it's not given us to see the soul. The reed flute is fire, not wind. Be that empty. Hear the love fire tangled in the notes as bewilderment melts into wine. The reed is a friend to all who want the fabric torn and drawn away. The reed is hurt in itself, combining intimacy and longing for intimacy. One song, a disastrous surrender, and a fine love together. So that's what he writes, right? And his students are like, well, damn, okay? And then he continues with that with 6 volumes. So this is 6 volumes, this thing. And what it is people have compared it, at least in its composition, to the Arabian Nights. How many of you have read the Arabian Nights? Okay, so the Arabian Nights, it's interesting, this sort of literary style where it's a story within a story within a story within a story, and it gets kind of convoluted, and some characters kind of go across the whole narrative, and then some get lost, and it's been compared to being like a dream, how our dreams are, right? That's how the Masnavi is. It just kind of sucks you in, and you're in this kind of dreamlike place where all these different stories are coming up. He takes traditional Abrahamic stories and puts a twist on them. He takes stories of the Prophet Muhammad, puts a twist on them, but always he's trying to illuminate this inner sense, this gnosis, or this Gnostic way of reading the Quran and understanding the tradition. And it was mind-blowing. And the students, and this book, the Masnavi, is what any Mevlevi lodge, this was the text. So, we have the holy books of Thelema, they have the Masnavi, that is the core of their tradition. So he writes all that, that's his big accomplishment before his death. He then dies. His body is then put into this mausoleum, which still stands to this day. And it still serves as, I guess, the closest thing to a Mevlevi lodge that's allowed to exist in the country of Turkey today. But there is where you can see some of the public performances of the Sema, or the Whirling Dance. And yeah, it's in Konya, and you can visit there. I've never been, but that's on my bucket list. So, so they bury him. So let me pause for a moment. Does anybody have any questions? I've given you all of that because that's how you make sense of his poetry. And then I'm going to talk about the actual order of the Mevlevis. That's my next section. Yeah, Keith.
So maybe you said it and my ears blinked, but so Rumi knew that Shams was gone. I presume he knew he was dead. Did he know that his students killed him?
See, that's where all three of your questions are great. We don't know. It depends on which version of the story you read, and then what's the outcome, because even those versions are different.
Having that information, and like if you presume that perhaps he did know, it's like the entire rest of his career was continually swagging on his students about, you assholes fucked it all up.
Yeah, and exactly, and actually arguably the entire ritual, the entire Sema dance, knowing that story is crucial because all the symbolism is actually, or at least a huge chunk of it, derives from this notion of Shams' death and that he's buried, right? So death and shuffling off this mortal coil, those are things that come up in the dance, right? And that comes from Shams' murder and his death and burial, right?
The story of how that started.
Right. Okay. So that's my next thing. So after Rumi dies, any other questions before I jump? Sorry. I'm sorry.
Why? I thought, at least until recently, the Turkish government since the early 20th century was secular. So why do they feel so threatened by the Mevlevi order?
Great question. I'm trying to figure out how I should answer this without getting us in trouble with anyone.
Some people think this, some people think that.
Thank you. I'll just say this. Secular doesn't always necessarily mean no opinion on a religious institution. I'll just leave it at that. Okay? That's really, I mean, it's complicated about why the government would do that, but I'm not in Turkey, and I but I just know that it's illegal. Like, for example, if you are a Mevlevi Sufi in Turkey right now, if you wanted, as far as I know, if you wanted to start your own group somewhere, that would technically be an illegal act. But yeah, anyway, it's a good question. It's something to think about. Yeah.
You were saying that there's not like a central authority, but are there different groups or lineages that claim to be, the one and true source and all that?
Sure. Yeah. There are definitely certain groups that say, look, we're following this lineage of scholarship all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. And for every official Sufi order to be an official Sufi order, they have to be able to claim that there's some sort of heirship going back to the Prophet Muhammad. Some of the orders say they were founded by some of Muhammad's closest companions, but it ultimately ends up going back to him. That's just sort of how you establish. That's a way of establishing your authority, which is not uncommon in many groups, but it definitely in Islam, it's like, okay, on whose authority are you even sitting here talking about this stuff? Oh, well, I have a list of this is my teacher, my teacher, my teacher, my teacher, all the way going back, right? So, any other questions before I? No, okay. So after his death, of course, then there's this question of like, so what now, right? Like how, like where do we go from here? And again, one thing that I should point out is that during his lifetime, yes, Rumi did whirl, and that's where we get this whirling from. But it wasn't really. He didn't say, okay, everyone, this is how you're going to do this too, and this is how you can perform the Sema. Now, the Sema is not unique to the Mevlevis. Sema is a religious dance that's done in a mystical context that is performed by a number of different Sufi groups, and you'll see it performed in various different ways. A very common one is a group of people in a circle, and they're usually all very close together, and they are moving, and they are chanting, and so there's always this rhythm, and you've got music going, but what type of instruments are being used, what type of dances are they doing, all that's going to vary based on culture, based on tradition, and how much influence do the legal scholars have in what that Sufi group is doing? Because music as a topic within Islam is super controversial. It just is. What type of instruments can you use? Was the Prophet Muhammad okay with this instrument, or was he not okay with this instrument? It depends on which hadith or tradition you read. Does the Quran say anything about music? Well, kind of depends on which verses you isolate, right? So there's these various opinions on these things, and the reason why the lines get blurred and why it gets controversial is because especially in Persia, but in the Middle Eastern culture around this time, a lot of the things that Sufis were, their style of ritual reminded some of the more conservative scholars of what they would see in like a wine tavern or a wine inn, right? So if you went into a wine bar, you know, in Damascus, for an example, which by the way would be on the outskirts of town. There's no way that would be. This is like certain areas in the geography of the city. You'd go in and there would be dancing, wine, music, young people. I mean, it sounds great, right? But to the more orthodox, it was like, well, no wine, no, you know. So it's like a negative association. The Sufis, though, would take that environment and then they turn it on its head by making it esoteric and mystical. So his son, Sultan Valed, is the one who actually composed the Sema dance, the way you see it now with the Whirling Dervishes. So that is founded by his son, and he decides that he wants the participants to dress in a certain way. And the way that they are dressed is they are dressed in a outfit that, again, is symbolic of the grave. So you see the conical hats that they wear represents the tombstone. The black cloak that's over everything else is the hurqa, and beneath that is that's meant to represent, you know, basically your funeral garb, you're dead. And the way that the ritual occurs is they are led into the sacred space in the Teki Hall by a postnishin. And a postnishin would be the equivalent of our deacon here. So the postnishin leads everybody in, and they do, once they walk in, they start with their right foot first into the hall, because that's sacred space, as I mentioned that earlier, and they will repeat Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, and they will walk around the sacred space 3 times, but the deacon or the postnishin will stand at a particular spot, and when people pass him, they bow, and then they keep going on their circuit 3 times around. Once they've done that, they sit, everyone sits, and then there is the playing of the reed flute, which is the opening musical number. They do a few bows, they will say a few phrases after this occurs. They'll walk around one more time, and it's at that point that they do 4 10-minute sections of the whirling, okay? And they go into different formations, but it all is meant to represent, according to Sultan Valed, and he claims that this was explained to him by his father Rumi, that what happens is when you go to start your turning, you've taken off that black robe, the hurqa, and what's underneath is the white gown that has, it's weighted actually with I think some iron at the bottom, so that when you whirl, it lifts off and it creates that circular pattern as you're whirling, right? So they're whirling, and when you're whirling and you're in the lodge and you're doing this, you are the microcosm of the macrocosm as everything is whirling, right? You are this embodiment of the solar system turning, of everything turning, right? And most people, as they're spinning, will just repeat Allah, Allah, in the name of God, over and over again, and they do this. And it is tough to do this, okay? It takes a lot of practice. You get dizzy very easily, and that's a huge part of the training, is actually learning like how to do this and not throw up, okay? And it's hard to describe, and I was taught how to do it. I'm not going to do it now, but even when I try to do it, even now, it's really difficult for me to do it. Because you have to kind of train your eyes to not follow things, but your eyes are slightly open. So it's really bizarre. But what it does is you feel incredibly warm by the end of it. It's this internal heat that you feel. And Rumi captured that very well, because he described the process of initiation into the Mevlevi order and everything they do. He did invoke alchemical language. Now, pause for a second. I don't know what his sources were for his alchemical references, because he doesn't cite his sources. But the language, for those of you who study alchemy, it's not a coincidence. You're reading it going, okay, here's some alchemical language here, and he describes that process of turning as being cooked. You're being cooked, right? And it's always this constant process of burning things off and trying to get down to this pure source. Any questions on anything that I've said so far about that? Okay. So they do these 4 sections. And once they finish, they all return to their seats. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, this is another cool thing. Before they stand up to actually start the whole whirling process, after the reed flute is played, to initiate to stand up, they all slap their hands on the ground and they stand up, and that's a representation of what it's going to feel like during the day of resurrection. Okay, so it's like, you're dead, but then Allah is going to resurrect everyone, right? And it's going to be this like, you're awake again, right? So that's a representation. So you come in and you're dead, and you're wearing the funeral garbs, but then you slap your hands, you're like, oh, I'm awake now, I'm alive, and you take off the black cloaks. So they say, this is, the closing prayer is this. They say, may the grace of God and the spiritual aspirations of true dervishes be present and witnessed in us. For the sake of the blessed breath of our master Mevlana, Rumi, the secret of Shams of Tabriz, the generosity of Imam Ali, who is the Prophet's son, and the intercession of the Prophet, let us all say who. And who is H-U, and it's a word that's invoked that's basically the summary of anything that could be attributed to the divine in one word. It is this summary of all those attributes. And in Islam, he has 99 attributes. So who is capturing that right there? They say peace to each other, assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam. Then they say who again, say peace to each other again, who for the last time, and then the ritual's over. So the process of becoming a dervish, you had to join this order, and you could be as young as, there are reports that say that there were like 13, 14-year-olds who were walking through the door to be initiated, and it wasn't a cakewalk. You had to spend a lot of your time actually literally in the kitchen helping out, and there is this alchemical metaphor, being in the kitchen, you're cooking and preparing things, and so you had kitchen duty first. And as you went through the degrees, you could decide, do you want to play an instrument? If so, which one? Or do you want to be mainly a whirling dervish? And as you were going through these degrees, you were trained in the necessary texts, you were trained how to whirl, and you were reading tons of Rumi and studying the Quran and getting that education. I don't have any other details about the degree work for 2 reasons. One, because I never officially joined the Mevlevi Order's initiatory track, so I never was actually officially initiated into it, so I don't know what it's like to be initiated into it. And then the documents really aren't that detailed. Like, we know that stuff happened, we know that people got certain degrees and they were taught certain things, but how that process is actually spelled out, no idea. And I think maybe only they know, unless someone has leaked it onto the internet, which is always possible. Let's see.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Are there any roles for women in this order?
Oh. Historically, even during Rumi's time and during Sultan Valed's time, women were admitted into the order. But during that time, you would never have had the mixing of men and women in the same ritual. It would never have happened.
So the women could be dervishes as well?
Yes, but they had their own separate area with which they would do their whirling.
Were their teachings any different?
Not that I'm aware of. But having said that, though, by the time the Mevlevis reach the United States, the initiation of men and women and then having men and women in the room together becomes a thing, right? And that, it was controversial when it first arrived here. And I had the chance of meeting some of these folks, and honestly, some of these sheikhs, I don't even know if they're alive still, okay? But at the time I knew them, which was 10 years ago, they were already pretty up there, but I actually got to meet some of the folks who kind of came down on the more conservative side of this question. And there was a schism that occurred with this local group that I used to belong to over this question of, so women too? Right? And if so, what's that going to look like? But the group that I was with, there was no distinction made. Everyone was in the same room together. Everyone taught. It was taught and was hanging out and practicing all together. All right. So that was my experience. But as far as I know, in other areas that have a more traditional outlook on it, there is still that separation. But in terms of the education, I think it was the same. I don't know of any difference. Yeah. Any other questions? I sort of feel like that's kind of everything I wanted to say in terms of like the overall talk. So if
How
there,
common in numbers, if you were to give them, like we know that they're more Sunni than Shia, but
Yeah.
if we were gonna give it like a proportion, just to get a perspective, how many Sufis are there, do you think, worldwide?
again, I don't even know if I could give you even a hypothetical, to be honest, because Sufism, unless someone identifies as a Sufi first, meaning that they belong to maybe some sort of international group, or one of the groups here, and you might meet someone who says, I'm a Sufi, right? If you start asking them more questions, though, the person who identifies as Sufi may not identify as Muslim. So that makes it kind of confusing. And then not all Muslims would identify as Sufi. When I was a Muslim, I did identify as a Sufi, but my friends who were born into the faith said that they were uncomfortable calling themselves that because from their perspective, if you told people you were a Sufi, it meant that you were super committed to the spiritual dimension of the faith, and that was a pretty big deal to say that, right? So I think some folks might dabble in it, but not go. So I really don't know, to be honest with you, how many numbers. I can tell you some of the countries where it's very prevalent, like in India. There's a number of different orders that exist. In Indonesia, that's true as well. The Mevlevis are still technically in Turkey. North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia does have certain Sufi orders that I don't know very much about, very just basic knowledge of it. So it is still an international phenomena. I just don't know exactly what the ratio would be. And then also to make things more complicated, there are some Shia who do identify with their own Sufi groups that are on the Shia end of things.
So that Shia mysticism that's Sufi related,
Yes.
would you say?
Oh yeah.
But not, it's like more Ismaili sort of mysticism as opposed to the Sufi mysticism, is that it? Or how would you describe that?
I think there is distinct Shia mysticism, like Ismaili Sufi or Ismaili Shia Islam is very esoteric in its own right, and it's not considered like a Sufi branch. But there are Sufi teachings that have made their way into Shia circles, and so there you have like this blending that has occurred, right? So it's everywhere, and that's why it makes kind of the numbering so hard to really fathom. But there are mosques that are dedicated as being exclusively Sufi mosques. Some of those have been destroyed because Sufis were definitely on ISIS hit list, along with a lot of other indigenous groups in the area. So a lot of the mosques that were destroyed were either Shia oriented or sometimes Sufi oriented too. Yeah.
Interestingly, the last two Ayatollahs were both big fans of Hafez and
Oh, really?
Rumi.
Yeah.
They put a somewhat different spin on it than your average Californian.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, Hafez is buried in Iran. I'm blanking on the exact city that his mausoleum is in, but Hafez is another really controversial figure because he also would say things like, don't pay attention to scholars and take your prayer rugs and throw the wine of God onto your prayer rugs. And he was just pissing people off left and right. But he has that interpretation because some of these heroes, the orthodoxy can see how popular they are. And they are. So trying to put that spin on, well, yeah, they said those things, but, which reminds me, the homoeroticism. How could I forget that, right? So, this story's not complete yet. So I had mentioned that, there's this whole debate, so what was up with Shams and Rumi? Were they lovers? Were they not? And that, unfortunately, that will probably never be settled because of so many different factors. Scholarship trying not to divorce Rumi from what is perceived as his Islamic Orthodox heritage gets in the way. But the language, I don't know. If someone were to ask me, do I think their relationship was strictly platonic, I would say there's no way. That would be my reaction to it. Because if you just look at the outpouring of grief, right? And the amount of time Shams is mentioned repeatedly throughout the entire text. I mean, they may not have been lovers, but there was something deep going on there, and that's for sure. This book that I have here tries to settle it a little bit by just saying that. So this is speaking for Shams, I believe. I first came to Rumi with the understanding that I would not be his sheikh. God had not brought him into being on this earth one who could be his sheikh. He would not be immortal. But nor am I one to be a disciple. It's no longer in me. Now I come for friendship, relief. It must be such that I do not need to disseminate ideas, or the Arabic word is nefaq, which is like disseminate law. Most of the prophets have taught. They've done that, expressing contrary to what is in your heart. In my presence, as he, Rumi, listens to me, he considers himself. I'm ashamed to even say it, like a 2-year-old child or like a new convert to Islam who knows nothing about it. Amazing submissiveness. I need to be apparent how our life together is going to be. Is it brotherhood in friendship or sheikhhood in discipleship? I don't like this. Teacher to pupil? So, and that's all he says about it. So even Shams is like, what is our relationship? Complicated.
So the relationship between Shams and Rumi is one between a teacher and a student almost. So Shams seems like Rumi's sheikh in a way, right?
Yeah, but this is Shams saying, am I?
Okay, yeah, sure. But we have like Rumi like being passionately involved, both of them being passionately involved in this relationship.
Yes.
And is this notion of like a spiritual teacher and a spiritual disciple something which runs deep in Sufism?
It does, yes. And it is that student-teacher relationship that is very consistent throughout the Sufi orders. So it is, it is a special relationship. It's one that doesn't exist outside of that context. And even though we hear Shams saying, oh, I don't really know if I am, obviously he was in that role for Rumi, whether he liked it or not, right? And that was, and it was intense, obviously. They were both transformed by it, but Rumi was definitely transformed by it.
And another just follow-up question on that. Is there a sense too in which that relationship, I mean, so my understanding is that the sheikh doesn't necessarily need to be a physical person, that there is the sense of a spiritual teacher, maybe roughly equivalent to what we would talk about in Thelema as a relationship with one's holy guardian angel. I don't know if you have any comments in regards to maybe the more symbolic dimension of that student-teacher relationship.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are a number of accounts of Sufis who, whether they're masters or students, who report, being visited by teachers through dreams, through visions, and we're talking about teachers like who've been dead for quite some time, and then, I think. I'm really glad you mentioned the parallel to the Holy Guardian Angel, because I do think that that's a solid comparison, because I think eventually what ends up happening is the student ceases being a student, at least in that particular relationship, right? And I think this is at the core of the Shams Rumi story, is this almost like over-dependency on the master. Right? So Shams, in that statement that I read, is almost saying, like, feeling uncomfortable, like, it's almost like I'm talking about like a 2-year-old child here, right? Which is like, that's how much dependence there is. And you can see how grief-stricken he was, but it's almost like with Shams's death, Rumi's almost like absorbed Shams's essence into him, which is why when he ends almost all those poems, it's something to Shams. Oh, Shams. Something, 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 right? So that there's an invocation at the end of each line, right? Or at each poem. I don't know if I would want to say that Shams becomes his holy guardian angel, but I do think that image of the radiant person and attributing him to the sun as a symbol, an internal sun. I mean, that's pretty intense, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that really answers the question,
totally, yeah.
but I think that those questions are well said, and I think the parallel is there, definitely. Yeah.
It almost almost sounds from a more maybe Jungian point of view, like there was a heavy transference going on, and then the murder that cut it off, and he had to resolve it for himself from that point.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely. Yeah, yeah, a grieving process for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So with like the group in Berkeley, how far along can you be involved with that without converting to Islam?
It's a good question. So that was another kind of point of the schism, was like, is this meant to bring people to Islam or to Mevlevi Sufism? Or something in between. The group fell on, you don't need to convert to Islam to be part of this group. Like I said, some more kind of conservative individuals, that was another reason why they were like, well, okay, wait, so you're allowing women to be in the same space, you're initiating women left and right, you don't care if they convert to Islam or not, that's not a requirement. Yeah, that there's a point of contention there with that. But the group that I belong to, and I don't think they're still in Berkeley now. Last I heard, and it's been a while since I've even been in contact with the group. They were doing other things more like in Marin County, but yeah, I don't know. I think they went on the more, I guess, liberal side of just like, you don't need to. There was no pressure to convert to Islam for people who showed up. Yeah.
Well, and it sounds like it's much more of a Gnostic kind of practice anyway. So if you're, what is there to convert to if it's really Gnostic? I mean, there's a framework and there's some text, but
Yep. And that's sort of like the riddle, I think, of esotericism or mysticism anyway, right? When it's got the outer trappings, but there's that inner core, right? And I think that, I think for this group in particular, it's like, hey, this is the inner essence here, and that's what we're focusing on, right? Yeah. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Okay. Keith, did you?
Is there evidence of influence on the Sufi sheikh disciple model coming from like the Hindu or Buddhist guru chela model? There are definite parallels there.
Yeah, I would say it's possible, but I don't know if there's solid evidence for that. I mean, like I said earlier, there's so much eclectic groups that were in, Turkey at the time, and, even prior to that, Baghdad had a pretty robust multicultural presence, southern Spain, Alhambra, but that's almost like a chicken and the egg question, I think, like I think the parallels are there because I think they're there, but I'm not.
Think alike.
Or that, right? Yeah.
Could have been a natural
Yeah.
development.
Yeah.
Sure.
Could have been, I mean,
Yeah.
Silk Road.
But when you're in a city with all these different traditions, like here we are in the Bay Area, with all these different traditions floating around, it's like, well, of course, hanging out and borrowing is going to occur, right? It's natural, but yeah, there could be that independence too of just looks familiar because it's another group of Homo sapiens doing this thing that we do, which is spiritual religious observances and practices, right?
Partly it occurred to me to wonder, because as you were talking about your disbelief that this level of anguish could come out of that loss unless their relationship were perhaps more physical as well as spiritual. In those guru traditions, it's like certainly can be physical, and especially if you've got the right matched sets of genitals for people's orientations. Yeah, but it's quite common for one to be more attached to one's guru than to one's partner.
Wow.
Like,
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
because it is. I mean,
Sure.
that is the sun around which you orbit.
Yeah.
This is just my life.
It's like falling in love with your doctor.
That's fair enough. I appreciate you sharing that and making that point. Because I think what it is when you read, at least for me, one thing that I've learned about Rumi is that I think the reason why he appeals and why he's so popular and why so many people resonate with him is because he is talking about these raw emotions, and he's not necessarily saying, so I wrote all this stuff because of this, right? It's like you can really put yourself into the poems. And so if you're, and I think most people can, most of us have experienced great grief and loss and feelings of separation. And that's really at the core of his teachings and of his poetry, is that yearning. The quest is not so much like, oh, I know that there's happiness down the road. The quest is like, well, I feel really crappy right now, and I want to find a way to like relieve that to some extent, because I used to not be separated, I used to not be in this pain, but I am now, so how do I relieve that? That's at the core of his teachings, and I think that that does resonate with a lot of people. But yeah, I think it's very well said that, you know, the scholars who say, nope, it was completely platonic, it was just a student-teacher thing, cool. That's fine, if that's what it was, that's great. But man, the poetic output that came after it, it's incredible. Any other questions? I can see that everyone's starting to kind of have that face of like, okay, I think we're done. so I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Love is the law, love under will.
Yay.